Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. It is exactly 8:37 a.m. News and views on Salam Media. And of course, 8:37 a.m. South African time as we cross over to Nigeria. And we'll be talking with political analyst based in Nigeria. That is Dr. Mukhtar Imam. Assalamu alaikum to you. Welcome to the program.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you indeed for your time. We're here to talk about the coup in Niger and also the threats being made by the EU and other Western nations. They've condemned the coup outright, and they are also saying that they are going to cut off all aid to the people of Niger. As it is, Niger is one of the poorest countries in the world, one of, not the poorest, but one of the poorest countries in the world. And they are very, very dependent on foreign aid, obviously. How does the picture look to you? And I'm wondering, there are two issues here that we're having to talk about. The first is the coup, or how are people in Niger responding to the coup, and obviously the ousting of the democratically elected president. We're also hearing that he hasn't been seen or heard from in the past few days. Does that perhaps mean that he's been arrested or possibly even killed? I sincerely hope not. And then the other issue is the issue around the aid, the much needed aid for the people of Niger. Over to you, Dr. Mukhtar Imam.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, you see, just at a time where we were thinking or were beginning to think that democracy and the democratization process has come to stay and that coups have become old-fashioned and out of vogue. Incidentally, we're beginning to witness the resurgence of coups across the African continent, a resurgence of what played out in the 1950s and 60s, the period which we termed or we have dubbed the age of independence on the African continent. From the 1950s and 60s up till the 1990s, the African continent, across the African continent, there were over 90 coups across the African continent. Incidentally, just again, like I said, at the time when we thought democracy was here to stay, we're beginning to witness again a resurgence of those coups. From 2019, 2020 up till this time, we've seen not less than 6 or 7 military coups, which is rather unfortunate. You see, this military incursion and military intervention into the political space is not something that should be tolerated or welcomed at this time. As far as the leadership is concerned, the president, Boazem, has not been seen, obviously, like you have stated. Leaders across the African continent have, raised their voices in this concern. In this regard, their concerns in this regard. The current leadership of ECOWAS, led by our own president, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, has made its position known as far as the posture of the president, the civilian elected, legally or legitimately elected president is concerned, and has issued stern warning to the coupists to say the president's life and health should not be tampered with and that he should be released with immediate effect. Of course, these are all rhetorics. But there are strong diplomatic stance, which basically goes to speak to what leaders across the African continent are saying and are thinking and will act upon. So as far as that is concerned, I do not think he has been harmed. If he has, we would have heard. This is not the type of coup. There are various types of coups. Of course, the reformists, the veto, the palace coup. What we're witnessing, I think, is more or less a palace coup. But I believe strongly well that what was seen might be a replica of the case of Omar al-Bashir. He was held for a while. He wasn't heard from for a while until over time he was released. So I'm hopeful that he's still well and safe and will be released with time. As far as the aid issue is concerned, Niger, like you rightly mentioned, is one of the poorest countries across the African continent, one of the lowest GDPs as far as West Africa and the entire African continent is concerned. And it has largely over the years depended on foreign aid from countries like the United States and so on and so forth. So basically, cutting aid will not necessarily at this time be, a right decision or a right step, or a step in the right direction. Because when you look at the issues of aid, it is akin to the issues of sanction. When you try to cut off aid or issue sanctions, you must think along the lines of smart sanctions, not this line of thinking that Western pundits and Western governments and institutions are towing. The reason being that it's hurtful, or it harms more the ordinary people in that state, much more than it does these individuals who are either holding on to power or who are who are incursing into the political space, such as the coupists, for example. So I do not think that's something that should be tinkered with, because it's going to severely hurt the economy of Niger, one that is already struggling. There's high inflation as far as the economy of Niger is concerned. Just recently, the president of Niger was the just ousted president was in Nigeria to talk about issues of ties, issues of electricity, and how Nigeria can support Niger. So at this time, cutting off aid will not necessarily be something that should be tinkered around. Of course, the United Nations has a lay down principle in its General Assembly that when a coup occurs in a country within the space of 60 to 90 days, if that trend or that situation is in reverse, the UN obviously will cut ties with that country or the leadership of the country, which it sees as being illegitimate. But again, my position remains that cutting or blocking aid to Niger at this time shouldn't be a welcome development.
Let's understand, why do you suppose the coup has happened? Number one. We also understand that there are quite a number of people that are supporting the coup, which does then suggest that there has been problems with the current government. And then you spoke about the United States and the UN. We also know that the United States has two military bases in Niger with over 1,100 soldiers. And of course, that comes at a price. They're not there, to actually support or help the people of Niger, but they are there because of their own. They use that as a base, for their own purposes and their own agendas. And obviously, that is why they're giving the aid to the people of Niger. So let's look at this global picture that I've just painted. The reason for the coup, there are people that are pro the coup, and the United Nations stance on it. Does it mean that if the coup does develop beyond the time that you've specified, 90 days, I think, that the United States will pull out their troops and then go and form a base in one of the neighboring countries and then give them the aid instead? Let's look at all of those issues.
Well, first and foremost, about the reason for the coups, for this particular coup, there are a number of factors that basically instigate coups, and we have seen this play out over the years. There's one of them is obviously the lack of professionalism on the part of the military, and part of the reason why we see a lack of professionalism on the part of the military is because of the nature of recruitment into the military across the African continent. Of course, if you understand the history of the evolution of the military of the army across the African continent, it started as from the Revolutionary Citizens Army, of course, into the administrative army, and that administrative structure of the army was basically created, so to speak, by the colonial incursion. And this is the nature of the military that they have bequeathed to us, the type of military that they still have some level of leverage over. So basically, you see that there's a bit of lack of professionalism on the part of the army. The hunger, the thirst for coming into the political space and getting involved into political activities. That's one of the reasons. And then, of course, part of the reasons why coup happened is also what we call the bushfire effect, which we see playing out today. This happened in the 50s. If you look at the trend in the coups that basically took place across the African continent right after independence, you will see that it happened one year after another. So there's that bushfire effect when it happens in one country, there's a tendency for it to occur in another country, and so on and so forth. And so it continues to spread. That has played out again, like I said, in the 50s, and we're beginning to see that happen here again. Because, like I said, from 2019 up to 2020 till today, we've seen about 7 military incursions, or what we call coups. So basically, that's one of the factors. Another factor, of course, is what, particularly with recent times, is basically the democratic reversals that is happening across the world. Not, it's a global phenomenon. You see, people are beginning to get tired of the lack of the lack of delivery of the goods of the deliverables of democracy, or the dividends of democracy to the people. And so people are seeking alternatives, unfortunately. And this is what is leading us to where we are today. We see what is happening all across the world. People are protesting in virtually every country against their government, including the United States. I mean, look at what happened when Trump, in the era of Trump, pre and post Trump era. It gives you a clear picture of what is happening. It's becoming a trend all across the world. There's a democratic reversal, and it's because leaders are not being accountable to citizenry. And so people are beginning to seek alternatives. People are going haywire, and perhaps that's the reason why we're seeing the coup-ists on the streets protesting for the coup, which is an aberration, which shouldn't make any sense. But that's what we're beginning to witness, because people are tired. People are beginning to feel that they're not. What legitimizes power is authority, and they have handed that over to the civilian administration, and the political will isn't there. And then, of course, there's the issue of corruption. The corruption across board is really rather unfortunate. You see the sit-tight syndrome of civilian administrations. They come to office and they want to continue to remain there, even though they come in the name of democracy. And this happens to have a process. It's the democratization process. And you cannot just jettison that after you have assumed office. But of course, the sit-tight syndrome isn't playing out in the case of Niger, because of obviously the leadership of Niger has not outlived its tenure. So basically, these are some of the factors. And then, of course, there is also the crisis, the external intervention in all of this. So we can categorize this into two. There is the internal contradiction, which is basically a summation of all the things that I have mentioned earlier. And then there is the external factor, which again leads to the other part of the discussion, which you talked about. France is intervening. The Franc-Afrique policy hasn't changed in any way. As a matter of fact, that's why we witnessed what we saw in Mali, and the coupists are saying, France, get out, leave our country, do not return. We do not want you here anymore. Take whatever you have come with and leave. This might be what we will witness in the case of Niger. Perhaps the coupists might tell the United States to move their troops. Like you rightly mentioned, they're over 1,000, over 1,000 military presence. We have over 2 to 3 drone bases run by the United States, all in Niger. So you see, all of these are factors. And of course, like you also mentioned, which is absolutely correct, they're there because of their own personal gains. We saw what happens in the days. What happened in the period of the ouster of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and the pretext upon which this invasion was done. The Blair Report, which came to Britain, stated falsely that Saddam was acquiring uranium and other associated products or resources, mineral resources from Niger. And the same was corroborated by the Bush administration in the United States, and that was the pretext for invasion. And ever since then, since they sent their troops and they sent their contract people and they sent their consultants into Nigeria to look around this mineral resource, which they so claimed that Saddam Hussein was there for, they have not moved out. They have remained there and have built bases. And now we're seeing them claiming, or hearing them claiming, that they're training the Nigerian military across the region to protect the Sahel because of the issues around the Sahel region, because of Boko Haram incursion and so on and so forth. So all of these are factors that are, the culmination of these factors is what is leading to all of these unrest we're witnessing. And obviously, we're going to hear from the coupists if they refuse to adhere to the warning of the ECOWAS leadership to say they need to hand over power back to the legitimate government. We're obviously going to hear from them what their position will be in the case of the military bases that have been established in their country. So we see these trends playing out. I mean, governance is not what it is anymore. People are beginning to. That's the crux. That remains at the center of all of these contradictions, all of these hallo we see and hear around the African continent. These are part of the reasons why the military, I mean, when you listen to the military, the first thing you hear from any coupists is corruption is the reason why they have taken over. The lack of political will is the reason why they have taken over. And when you look,
However, when the military takes over, that doesn't mean that they have actually done away or are in the process of doing away with corruption.
I was
They
going
are
to go there.
also they're also
They are
grabbing with both hands. My
exactly there.
my final question to you, and let's keep it short and sharp because we are running out of time. You mentioned France. We do know that we kind of asked the question why the people of Niger are fed up with French neocolonialism and have had enough. We also know that in France, 1 in every 3 light bulbs, and I'm coming to economics now, is powered by uranium from Niger. Meanwhile, in Niger, 80% of the people don't have access to any electricity whatsoever, and they live on less than $2 a day. And in the same vein, France, with that in mind, France is now condemning anti-French unrest in Niger following the coup. That does
Mhm.
suggest that they still want to keep their hands on their previous the previous colonial land,
Yes,
so to speak. They
yes,
still
yes.
they still have very, very vested interest. Over to you.
Of course, you see, France has never intended to leave any of its former colonies. Don't you see what the CFA means? I mean, it's former colonies of France. They do not intend to leave. The policy of assimilation by the French was one of the most fierce as far as colonialism was concerned, or is concerned, because we still see elements of colonialism, even though we want to term it as neocolonialism, plaguing the African continent, particularly the Francophone countries. The threat to echo to the single currency on the West African sub-region is actually France. France has always been at the heart of everything that its former colony does. France has never intended to leave. The policy of Francophone, like I mentioned earlier, is still very much alive, from economy, which you rightly mentioned, to the military sphere, to, of course, the diplomatic sphere, which is basically the political space. France has always been there. And these external interventions, this external control is the reason why we see all of these internal contradictions playing out. Because to the internal contradictions, just very quickly, the military itself, you see, part of the reasons why the military have continued to carry out these coups unabated is because, one, there haven't been any proper sanction against coupists. Never. Until the coup itself, the act of coup, becomes a felony, and whoever carries out that act or conducts that act or engages in that act is seen as doing something treasonable, these coups will continue. The reason is very simple. There's a huge bromance between the military establishment and, of course, the civilian population. And this is not just something that happens within the countries, within these countries themselves, but it is backed by external forces. The resources that they steal from this country, for lack of a better word, are basically being used to sponsor these coups, to sponsor the political establishment, and of course to continue to keep them in that position which they're in. And that's the unfortunate thing about all of this. Like you rightly mentioned, resources are taken, uranium is taken from Niger into France to power energy in France. But then, of course, the moment Niger begins to move towards enriching uranium, we'll begin to see what happened in South Africa. We'll begin to see how these guys will be, I mean, how the leadership or the individual, the elite structure within that state will be termed as terrorist organizations, just like they did to the ANC under Nelson Mandela. We'll begin to see these individuals being tagged terrorists, just like they did to Muammar Gaddafi, just like they did to Saddam Hussein. So these external interferences, this external hold and grip on former colonies is exactly the reason why we're seeing all of these things play out. We did not hear about all this until Russia began to send its mercenaries across the African continent, across Mali. Now we're hearing the leadership. Abdurrahmani himself stated that he was waiting for weapons from Russia, and that if ECOWAS doesn't
Okay.
the crisis. So it's
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm going to have to leave it there. Absolutely fascinating talking with you. And as you have so clearly outlined, once again, it's that invisible third force that is in the background playing out and instigating all of this unrest by way of coups, by way of protests, etc., because they have vested interest in the lands concerned. Look forward to talking with you in the future. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I thoroughly enjoyed your analysis. Keep us in your du'as, inshallah, and salamu alaikum to you.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
It's exactly 8:57 news and views on Salam Media. We're going to take an ad break. And of course, our correspondent, Zai Jadwood, is standing by with the 9 o'clock news.